Kabul's international airport has reopened after a day of chaos that brought evacuations to a standstill. People are desperately trying to escape the capital after it was seized by the Taliban. U.S. forces are in control of the airport as Western countries send in planes to retrieve diplomats and support staff. It's the last exit point out of Afghanistan not overseen by the militants. On Monday, several people died after crowds rushed onto the runway trying to escape the country.
For 24 hours, Kabul's Hamid Karzai International Airport was overrun by thousands of people desperate to flee. At least 7 died, some of whom had climbed onto the exterior of a military plane and fell as it took off. The chaos delayed international evacuation efforts. A German transport jet had to abort its flight after waiting for the runway to be cleared. Another circled for 5 hours before the U.S. military was finally able to secure the airport. Several coalition countries have pledged to get Afghans who worked as military interpreters or embassy staff out of the country, along with their own citizens still on the ground. As the Taliban take control of the rest of the city, U.S. President Joe Biden has threatened to use devastating force if they interfere with U.S. operations. Outside the airport, the new rulers are in complete control and have already begun hunting down their enemies.
Kabul residents are reporting the Taliban have already started house-to-house searches in some neighborhoods, registering names and looking for people in their target list. There are already reports of target killings and looting in the city. Kabul residents are living in absolute fear right now.
The Taliban had promised to respect people's safety and property when they first entered the city.
For more, let's bring in Franz Marti. He's a journalist and joins us on the phone from Kabul. Franz, day 2 with the Taliban in charge. You've been out on the streets talking to people. What's it like in Kabul now?
It's pretty calm inside the city itself. There's little traffic, not that many people on the streets. Most shops are closed, but some are open. Some people are in the street. It is like calm. People don't seem to be panicking or afraid, but they also seem to be like still wary because no one is sure what exactly will come. So it is like a little bit more silent than usual, and reactions vary. There are people that ask me in private for a visa to get out. Because they think as a foreigner I can help to obtain a visa. And there are people that told me they are happy that the Taliban are back and there's any shade in between. So reactions are really varied.
The Taliban have declared a general amnesty for government officials, Franz. I understand they are even urging women to join a new government. What do people there make of these pronouncements?
It's not completely new. The Taliban have, at least since a year, if not longer, called on government forces to surrender and promise them amnesty. This is kind of just a reiteration. So far, this seemed to have been part of an orchestrated Taliban strategy to incentivize surrenders. Militarily, the Taliban would probably not have been able to take over the country. So with their strategy of promising amnesty, they managed that troops surrender and that they could swiftly take over the country. Now they also still continue to assure people that everything will be fine. However, once in power, this might change. I already have gotten reports from a radio journalist who said Taliban came to his radio station and demanding him to shut down music, even Tarana, poems recited without music that the Taliban themselves use, were partly banned. He told me that the Taliban ordered him to only play Tarana that are jihadist in nature and not other things that are not completely jihadi. So, it remains to be seen how this will play out.
Okay, so it's still early days. People are waiting to see what's going to happen next. Evacuation flights have resumed at Kabul airport, meanwhile, after several people there died. What more can you tell us about the situation at the airport?
Like a minute or two ago, I saw a military plane, presumably a C-17, land in Kabul airport. I haven't seen planes taken off, but this probably just because, there's like not every minute a plane, so I might just have missed one. So it seems to be like more orderly than yesterday. Nonetheless, today in the morning, there were still reports that there are like hundreds or even thousands of people at the airport. Unfortunately, many Afghans still believe incorrect rumors that if you make it to the airport, Western country will fly you out without anything else needed. And people are apparently still trying to get out.
So people are going to the airport hoping to get out. Do Afghans who want to leave the country have any other options for getting out?
Now it seems like difficult. Other airports are, as far as I'm aware, were taken over by the Taliban and not operating anymore because the Taliban haven't like the skills or set up to like operate air traffic. Border crossings. Pakistan has apparently closed its borders, and also at the other border crossings, I'm not aware that they have like normalized. Also, neighboring countries seem to be like the people like wait to see what exactly will happen. So I'm not aware on land cross-border traffic.
Franz, thanks so much for keeping us up to date. Do stay safe. That was journalist Franz Marti in Kabul. Let's get some analysis now. We can talk to Amalendu Misra. He's a professor of international politics at Lancaster University. He studies violence in post-conflict societies. Thanks for being with us. Professor Misra, are you as shocked as the rest of us by the speed of the Taliban takeover?
Not really, because it was already on the cards. If you look at the facts and figures, the Taliban had already consolidated its authority and power some 3 years ago, almost over 65% of the country. And let's not forget that the nation-building exercise of the international community was only skin deep under the kind of normalcy. What we had was Taliban control of the rural areas. So when we talk about Taliban taking over, that there was no resistance, we have to sort of look at it in this particular perspective, that they already were in control. So that's the reason why it was such an easy walk for them, so to speak, into Kabul.
The Afghan military, they were well-trained, had state-of-the-art military resources, including an air force, which the Taliban do not have, and the Afghan military vastly outnumbered the Taliban. Why do you think they gave up?
There are two things here. First of all, we have to look at who were the recruits to the Afghan National Army. Though many of them were former Talibans. And also, we have to remember that in many occasions, these particular soldiers were in cahoots with the Taliban. So although they were sort of taking money from the government, they were sympathetic to the Taliban cause. And when we talk about their firepower, so the trainers were not there. The American trainers who were sort of supposed to teach them how to maneuver these aircrafts were not there. So they simply couldn't do it. So there is a part sympathy and part the fear as to what will happen in terms of reprisal, because they're the ones who are going to stay in that country. So that is the reason why they simply gave in and they sort of melted into thin air. And we also had desertions, whereby we had many soldiers fleeing to neighboring Tajikistan and Uzbekistan. So we have to look at that in that specific perspective.
The Taliban, who are now in control, they say they want a peaceful transfer of power. Do you think that's going to happen?
Well, it is not going to be peaceful because they have already taken over, coming with the motorcycles and Kalashnikovs and whatnot. And the kind of legally elected president has fled the country. So it is not peaceful at all. But having said that, they committed to it in the sense that they carried the burden now of governance. So they have to prove themselves to the Afghans as well as to the international community, whoever is going to support them. And just before he came in air, they were declaring a kind of general amnesty by asking the former administrative officials to come and join the government and continue the process. So there are early indications that they want to sort of be a kind of good managers, but only time will tell as to how they are going to perform.
Have the Taliban changed in the past 20 years, do you think? Can we expect them to rule the same way they did before, or is it going to be different?
Well, there are two Talibans here. The Taliban that emerged in the 1990s, most of them came from refugee camps in Pakistan who were sort of educated in a very fundamentalist madrasa-style education. So the new ones we have are born and brought up in Afghanistan. So they're more committed to their own country. So there are Taliban 1 and Taliban 2, if you put it that way, or newer Talibans. So I would say that they are more nationalistic and less interested in sort of turning Afghanistan into a kind of haven for external terrorists and so on and so forth. They have a particular vision of doing things that is an Islamic vision. And we have to see as to how they want to carry that forward. So definitely there has been a change in terms of what we had in the 1990s and what we have now.
Professor Misra, thank you very much for your insights. That was Amalendo Misra, professor at Lancaster University in the UK.
Thank you.
Well, U.S. President Joe Biden has rejected blame for the Taliban takeover. He admitted his administration had assessed the situation incorrectly, but he vehemently defended his decision to remove U.S. troops from Afghanistan. If anything, he said, the way events unfolded proved him right.
I stand squarely behind my decision. After 20 years, I've learned the hard way that there was never a good time to withdraw U.S. forces. That's why we're still there. We were clear-eyed about the risks. We planned for every contingency, but I always promised the American people that I will be straight with you. The truth is, this did unfold more quickly than we had anticipated. So what's happened? Afghanistan political leaders gave up and fled the country. The Afghan military collapsed, sometime without trying to fight. If anything, the developments of the past week reinforced that ending U.S. military involvement in Afghanistan now was the right decision.
Let's bring in DW's William Glucroft. He's part of our U.S. team. William, President Biden sounding almost angry in his defense of the U.S. pullout from Afghanistan. Is he trying to wash his hands of responsibility for how things have unfolded there?
It was a very remarkable address. Joe Biden, both in his public persona and people who know him well, say he's extremely empathetic. He's very compassionate. He really knows how to reach out to common people. We didn't really hear much of that in that speech yesterday. He was very defiant, very defensive. And the biggest criticism was that he only focused on withdrawal or not withdrawal. And that's not one of the main arguments that people are making, a lot of critics are making right now. It's not a matter of should we withdraw, should the United States withdraw, but how to withdraw. And Biden did not address very much at all, except for that little line we heard in that clip about recognizing that things were more chaotic than they expected. But he really did not address the lack of a plan that has led to a lot of this chaos that we're seeing now, and a lot of this instability and uncertainty. So it was the that it happened, not how it happened, that Biden really wanted to focus on.
Well, the president insisted in his address that the mission in Afghanistan was never supposed to be nation building, rather. But wasn't that what it turned into, William? Wasn't it nation building for many years?
Joe Biden was very clear about the limits of American power, American hard power, and that's something that we've been hearing for years, if not decades, that America often gets into these big military operations. We've seen this in Iraq as well and many other parts of the world, with these grand ideas and grand goals, but there's no real clear strategy, there's no clear exit strategy, and it's asking the military to do things that the U.S. military, really any military, is not really designed to do. This mission in Afghanistan began after 2001 as a counterterrorism operation, as a way to get rid of the Taliban. It was not meant to be a nation-building campaign, but that's exactly what it did become. And we can look towards, as Biden says, 4 U.S. presidents, the first one being George W. Bush, who put those troops into Afghanistan in the first place, and his administration came up with this original strategy, if you can call it that. You know, George W. Bush and his wife putting out a statement just recently expressing their sadness for what's going on right now. But they, a lot of the blame, a lot of what's happened lays at George W. Bush's feet and his administration, or for framing this war as something that we might have seen out of World War II, 2 great armies facing each other, requiring hundreds of thousands of troops, and then having to rebuild the country. But it's a very different situation in Afghanistan, and we're seeing the consequences of those actions or inactions now.
As you say, the U.S. initially went there to Afghanistan to address the terrorist threat following 9/11. Is Washington not concerned, William, that the country will again become a haven for terrorists with the Taliban back in control?
That was another interesting aspect of the address. I felt like I was listening to something from 10 or 15 years ago from a U.S. president. We haven't heard a lot about the threat of terrorism recently from the American administration. It's been more the focus on China, on Russia, on big power competition around the world. And this was, in this speech last night, counterterrorism and the threat of terrorism made a big resurgence. Joe Biden says that the U.S. military's counterterrorism operations are ongoing, that they're ready to address any kind of threat there may be, not only in Afghanistan and around the world. And he made a very clear statement that is going to stay the focus in Afghanistan going forward. He calls over-the-horizon operations, kind of lingo for the U.S. always being there. That's where we are right now. We'll see how Biden balances that with other threats that the U.S. faces going forward.
William, thank you very much. That was DW's William Glucroft. Here in Germany, Chancellor Angela Merkel has also reacted to the fall of the Afghan government. She said she felt most for those who spent the last 20 years hoping for a more liberal society.
This development is particularly that for the people in Afghanistan, a country which has suffered so much over the course of its history. It is a terrible development for the millions of Afghans who want a more liberal society, who have fought for one, and who have worked for democracy and development and education of girls and women. Our allies and the German armed forces have, of course, done a great deal, and we must never forget those people who paid for this with their lives, 59 Germans among them, or who paid with scars, both physical and emotional. And I'm thinking now of the pain of their friends and relations, now when everything seems to have been in vain.
Joined now by our chief political correspondent, Melinda Crane. Melinda, Chancellor Merkel there, she delivered her statement on Afghanistan just a few hours before President Biden, but she struck a rather different tone, didn't she?
Absolutely. In general, leaders here are taking quite a different, far less defiant tone than what we had just heard from President Biden. In fact, Chancellor Merkel was unusually forthright, even emotional, and appeared, if anything, humbled. She called the situation in Afghanistan bitter, dramatic, and terrifying, and said that the mission overall, beyond the fight against terrorism, was, quote unquote, not as successful as we had planned, seeming to suggest that the Western alliance should have defined narrower goals, which essentially goes exactly to that trade-off that William was just talking about, that mission creep as between essentially trying to stem terrorism as opposed to build democracy.
German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas, he's also been commenting on the situation in Afghanistan. Tell us what he's been saying.
Well, he said that yesterday that the German government, intelligence services, and the international community had misjudged the situation, and then said, quote unquote, neither we nor our partners foresaw the speed with which the Afghan security forces withdrew. And the fact is that the chaotic and tragic developments in Afghanistan have laid bare the degree of Germany's dependence on the U.S. in the area of security, for intelligence, for logistics. Leaders here acknowledged as much in Parliament at the end of June as Bundeswehr forces were withdrawing from Afghanistan, saying that once the U.S. had decided to leave, Germany simply had to follow. This is now prompting soul-searching and anguished debate here, with the Chancellor reportedly telling party colleagues behind closed doors that the U.S. actions had been driven by domestic American politics. But European leaders, and Mr. Maas will be meeting with his EU counterparts later on today, they absolutely face a dilemma. They're highly reluctant to criticize Washington openly because of their dependence on this very powerful NATO ally.
Germany is now involved in the evacuation from the Kabul airport there. There are reports that the first German Air Force plane returned to Germany with only 7 people on board. Do you know if that's the case?
Actually, the first transport flight sent to Kabul had to turn around without landing, and the second circled for 5 hours, uncertain whether it would be possible to land, and getting clearance only when it was about to run out of fuel. And because of the chaotic and dangerous situation yesterday at the airport, as well as because a curfew is in place at night, the Foreign Ministry had said earlier that people in Kabul should not go to the airport before they were notified. It seems that very few were notified because of the uncertainty about the ability to land. And with just a 30-minute slot on the ground, the crew took on those who were actually at hand, which reportedly was a handful of security personnel. In other words, yes, 7 people. The government is saying that the main goal of that flight was to bring paratroopers to Kabul so that they can help set up a robust airlift. But still, given that the window of time for these evacuations is limited and that the Chancellor has said some 10,000 people have been identified as needing evacuation, including local staff, as well as those who are especially in need of protection, like human rights activists, women who've been in the public eye. In view of those numbers and that limited window, this is a pretty slow beginning.
Melinda, thank you very much. Our chief political correspondent, Melinda Crane.